Can you explain the premise behind the two scenarios? What has been updated since the 2015 report?
Well, we devised the two scenarios to demonstrate plausible but distinct pathways out to 2050 for the entire UK energy system, so not just power but also heating, transport, industry and the infrastructure that connects those together, and all of that as part of a transition towards a low carbon target by 2050. In our clockwork scenario, we assume a higher degree of coordination at the national scale, so we start to see the emergence of technologies which perhaps require large-scale investment or infrastructure, but which ultimately can collectively contribute to an optimal energy system for the whole UK. So there's a bigger role for carbon capture and storage, there's a bigger role for nuclear, and we see a national programme to encourage the growth of sustainable biomass across the country. So for our patchwork scenario, we actually explored a slightly different society. So in that case, population growth is higher than in clockwork, but because of different social choices around urbanisation and sharing of assets across the economy, we actually see less energy demand overall in patchwork. But we've also assumed that there's less of the national scale coordination that we see in clockwork. So for patchwork, it has some role for carbon capture and storage, but it comes later and it's slower to build out. We only see 2 new nuclear facilities in patchwork, for example, and we don't see the kind of national coordination that would lead to a comprehensive programme to build out biomass production across the country. So it's able to play a much smaller role in the economy by 2050.
What's been updated since the 2015 report?
So since the first report was published in 2015, some of the government agency reports that we based our socio-economic trajectories on, like population growth and growth in the economy, industrial composition, some of those things, they've been updated annually. So we brought our scenarios back into line with the latest publications from there. In terms of technologies, we have a range of low carbon technologies now where we're starting to gain real world experience, things like solar PV, offshore wind, electric vehicles and batteries. So we've been able to better reflect the cost projections for those technologies on that basis. And for clockwork, we've introduced an entirely new technology solution in the form of hydrogen for heating within buildings. So that makes use of existing gas distribution networks to replace that natural gas with hydrogen to be delivered into our homes and buildings.
Is there any cost difference between the two scenarios?
Well, because clockwork and patchwork have both been allowed to follow a balanced and multi-vector approach, we see the costs rising gradually for sure, but reaching only around 1% of GDP by 2050 in each case. And we've tested that against alternative pathways where we enforce a particular single vector solution, so all electric in one case and all hydrogen in another. And what we find when we force our modelling to go down a particular single vector pathway is inevitably the costs begin to rise. So an all electric pathway would cost roughly double either clockwork and patchwork, and an all hydrogen pathway would be roughly 3 times the size of cost.
What emissions reduction targets have these scenarios been set up to meet, and how does that fit in with our commitments under the Paris Climate Change Agreement?
Well, both of our scenarios are set up to meet the current legislated targets, which is to reach an 80% reduction by 2050. But we're very interested in, and we know government is very interested in, the potential implications of what we've signed up for in the Paris Agreement, which holds us to try to meet no worse than a 1.5 degree temperature rise. We all expect that that will mean a net zero target at some point, well before the end of the century. For countries like the UK, that might be well before the end of the century, so we have to start thinking about how we prepare for that. And we've explored the role for negative emissions in both clockwork and patchwork. And it's possible to reach an 80% reduction target by 2050 without a role for negative emissions, certainly. It's more expensive, but it's possible. But it really doesn't look feasible at all to think that we can reach a net zero target without a role for some form of negative emissions as part of that.